I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. This last Monday was Columbus Day here in the United States. Because liberal leftists don't like white Europeans here on this continent, they set up Indigenous Peoples Day on the same day. So the Babylon Bee, and more specifically, not the bee, made a meme that I thought was hilarious. It read this. It said, carefully crafting a post about the horrors of colonialism in support of Indigenous Peoples Day from a $660,000 house on stolen land from an iPhone made by slaves. I thought it pointed out just the hypocrisy of many that believe this type of garbage. And it, it did draw fire from some people who it offended. I noticed in the comments, but it just definitely points out the hypocrisy of how there's people that believe we are on stolen land. I was at a school board meeting recently, and before they do anything at this board meeting, they all stand up and recite a land acknowledgement. If you don't know what a land acknowledgement is, they basically say that the United States is on land that we, the evil white people, stole from those peace-loving, pipe-smoking indigenous people that were, here before us. There is nothing in the acknowledgement that says that we will give it back or go back to Europe or something, but it makes them feel better somehow. And I think these things are absolutely ridiculous, and they're ridiculous liberal virtue signaling, in my opinion. But there are people that have a skewed view of history and take this stuff seriously. Take this article right here from Senna Crow. She writes for medium.com, and she wrote this actually a few years back in 2019, on November 7th of 2019. She said, and get this, the title includes this. It says, and yes, if you're wondering, this post is for white settlers. Anyway, this is what she says. She says, if you're not already actively working to unlearn colonizing habits and unconditionally support Indigenous people, now is the perfect time to start. It's November, and that means it's Native History Month. Native History Month urges us to ask how we can better recognize, support, and protect Indigenous communities. So she goes into a couple things that we're supposed to ask ourselves. She says, first, ask yourself this question every day. Okay, so we're supposed to ask it every day. Whose land am I living on? If you don't know the answer, you can look it up using the native-land.ca map. I actually went on to it. Instead of labeling by country or official government, the map shows Indigenous nations and their relative territories around the world. It's not a perfect way to think about Indigenous nationhood, but it's definitely a start. So if you actually go to this map, it's an interactive globe that shows areas of Indigenous territories of the past. So you can literally go around the globe and manipulate it and see, where certain tribes were and what was their, area supposedly. And the first thing you notice, though, is that there are so many overlapping areas that, at least in my area of the map, I tried to look at where I live and see, what tribe was there. I can't even see who was the predominant one. They're so overlapping. There's so many that were in this area, just, given different periods of time in history. But she goes on and she says, the second question to ask yourself, what do I own on this land? Or more directly, how have I benefited from this land? Maybe you have a house, a job, a car, a family. Maybe you earn a degree here. Maybe you have enough food in your cabinet. Maybe you're able to rest from work. Maybe you have savings. You couldn't have owned those things without the stolen land you stand on. Okay, let's stop there for a second. So, first of all, according to her, I own my family, right? And I would not have any of those things, including my family, if it were not for indigenous tribes, right? I mean, this is so ridiculous. There's literally people that not only believe this, but they believe it so much they would write an article about it. It's like this. All right, let's go on to the third one. It says, what people have lost from what I have gained. For many people who grew up in this settler colonial society, decolonization is a reckoning. It asks us to consider what we have truly earned and at what costs. But I'm not here to comfort you or entertain your guilt. Whoa. If that's what you want, you don't actually care about indigenous folks. Whoa. that got heated quickly. She says, the truth is, indigenous communities need resources, not apologies. Boy, wow. She says, if you can't offer services of or labor for Native communities this month, the best way is to spread wealth, or perhaps more accurately, return wealth and support communities so that they have the resources to be autonomous. What do I mean by this? And how is it helpful? Yeah, I would definitely ask those questions. Decolonization refers to the radical undoing of colonialization that continues to take place ever since colonizers first made contact with indigenous people over 500 years ago. Okay. But let me be clear here, she says. Okay, yes, let's please. Decolonization is more literally and urgent and more literal and urgent than anti-racism and representation. Those are certainly vital elements of the movement, but I agree wholeheartedly with Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's definition of decolonization as, quote, reappropriation of indigenous land and life, unquote. Meaning that decolonization requires settlers to return land back under indigenous stewardship. Did you hear what she said here? She says, decolonization requires settlers, white Europeans, to return land under indigenous stewardship. So what she's saying here is she's saying that we should give all power, political and otherwise, to indigenous tribes. That's what she's saying. She says, sure, we might be able to call out racist costumes, demand more positive representation of Native people in media, or make a land acknowledgement at an event. But what does this mean if we are not actively working toward reinstatement of indigenous governance? See, I told you that's what she's saying. She says decolonization requires settlers to offer their resources gained from stolen land to indigenous people and communities. She says it goes much farther than rent. The Duwamish tribe, located on coast Salish land we call Seattle. I tell you, I'm just going to stop right there. If you want to give back Seattle, and just like turn it over to them, to whatever tribe was there, a long time ago. Feel free. I've been to Seattle many times. Anyway, she says he goes much farther than rent. The Duwamish tribe, located in Seattle, used their real rent for Duwamish tribal services, which provides social, educational, health, and cultural services. And in addition, this rent funds the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center, which is a free museum, event space, and community center. So we're supposed to be paying rent. And she says paying rent to a community every month is also an opportunity for non-natives. Now, again, I'm going to stop here for a second. Who's a non-native? Is a non-native? What if I have some native, blood in me? If I go back through ancestry.com and I find some, a native, cousin twice removed or something. I mean, should I get rent from somebody? Do I have to give rent? Do I give less rent? I mean, how do we break this down? But I digress. She says, paying rent to a community every month is also an opportunity for non-natives, and specifically white settlers, okay, to consider and reflect on what it means to live on this land. Seems rather racist here, but anyway, real rent, Duwamish, for example, suggests choosing a rent amount that holds symbolic significance for real renters. Quote, paying $54 a month could serve as a powerful reminder of the 54,000 acres of homeland that the Duwamish tribe signed over. Did you hear that? They signed over to settlers in 1855. This is actually from the Real Rent website. However, she says, not every Indigenous group will have a program as direct as Real Rent. Some communities have opted into building a land trust to reclaim land and autonomy. The Sogori Tea Land Trust, based in the Bay Area, is a intertribal organization that seeks to gain access and ownership over the ancestral lands of Chochenyo and Karkian Ohlone folks. In their words, they envision, and this is what she says, quote, working toward the acquisition of a variety of lands situated throughout those two tribes and territory, with an emphasis on reclaiming parcels in the midst of an urban setting, unquote. So, in other words, they want part of San Francisco. And maybe Oakland, too. I don't know. You can have Oakland. Again, Seattle, Oakland, hey, they're yours. To acquire these lands, the Sogoi Tea Land Trust offers the choice to donate funds through a voluntary land tax. Ooh, a voluntary land tax. Wonder how soon that's going to be mandatory land tax. Paying rent to communities often opens up the means for folks to reconnect, heal, and advocate for themselves. And I want you to hear this, okay? This next part is really interesting. She says, keep this in mind. This is all really about redistributing settler capital so that Indigenous folks can acquire the means to be sovereign. She just said the quiet part out loud. This is a money grab. And everybody knows it. Reparations, when it comes to the Black community and the leadership calling for that, and all, it's all the same thing, right? It's a money grab. She just said it out loud. She said, keep this in mind. This is really about redistributing settler capital so that Indigenous folks can acquire the means to be sovereign. She says, I also want to stress that since there are over 500 federal recognized tribes and even more recognized tribes in the U.S., each with their own traditions, histories, and values, not every community needs the same thing. There's a million ways to provide resources. Communities and organizations are already doing amazing things. Use your privilege so they can continue to do so. Yeah, yeah. Many of these organizations we call casinos. Yeah, casinos. Anyway, and finally, listen, she says. I want you to hear this too. She says, and finally, listen. If your ears aren't muffled with the sound of your own guilt, you'll be surprised at what you can learn and how you can be a better advocate. Wow, that was pretty snarky too. I mean, anyway, just like a lot of liberal white women, they just have this hatred, this disdain for all kinds. They're just so mad at things, and you can just hear it come out here. Makes you really want to do what she's asking, doesn't it? Well, Jason D. Hill, PhD, he's of the atlassociety.org, and he wrote an article back in May of 2022 after he was actually almost like accosted by a group of college students that believed this nonsense. And he says this, he says, to begin with, there's no such thing as genocide of Native Americans, and no land was ever stolen. This is a case of the big lie, if ever there was one. There was a war for resources, and the Native Americans lost. They came in second, period. In effect, today, they are war refugees on conquered American soil. The Native Americans were the first genocidal warlords. Yes, the Native Americans were the first genocidal warlords on the continent. They stole the continent from the Hellenes Magnaefuna and slaughtered them into extinction. The French, the Spanish, and the English did the same with the Aboriginal Americans. For centuries, Native Americans had the land and did virtually nothing with it. That is, in terms of emancipating themselves from an animistic, biological, and cyclical lifestyle. The notion of process lay unknown to them. They existed outside the historical process. So he's going to go into what he means by that here. He says, European settlers acquired land that is now America through bargaining, purchase, and conquest. Most of the Indians died of disease unintentionally transmitted by Europeans to the natives who had no natural, inclination against them. Genocide denotes a willful intention. Did you hear what he said? Genocide denotes a willful intention to exterminate an entire population of people. Given the technological capabilities of the English and later the Americans, if they had wanted to eliminate the Indians from the continent, they could have done so easily. Instead, they subjected many of them to forced inclusion and assimilation. This is not consistent with a policy of extermination. There were isolated cases of European military commanders who did attempt to vanquish hostile Indian tribes by giving them smallpox-infected blankets, and there is no evidence to indicate that this was a systemic policy at all. The idea that the Indians were not willful participants in land purchasing and that they did not negotiate with the Europeans for, protracted periods of time is just punitively false. The notion that they all contributed to peace-loving assemblage of tribes as native at best, as naive at best, and a perniciously false attempt to camouflage history at worst. American Indians owned slaves. Did you hear that? American Indians owned slaves, including African Americans. And they conquered several competing tribes long after Columbus arrived on the continent. They burned villages, kidnapped children, raped women, and scalped their enemies. They behaved like savages. They did all this while remaining outside the historical process and contributing nothing of lasting significance to Western civilization or world civilization at all. The Native American indigening was a natural creature who had not yet transformed himself out of the biological time into an epic-making world historical person. Having failed to abstract himself from nature by transcending it, the American Aboriginal viewed himself as inexplicably bound to nature. To enter the historical process, one must see himself as transcendent from nature. So basically what he's saying here is that we as Christians, we believe that we are different than nature. We are different than animals. We are different than plants. Um, all life is not the same. Human life is definitely prioritized above other things because we have a soul, right? We can go to heaven. We are created in the likeness of God. But that's not what these these Native Americans believe. That they believed that we were all a part of nature. We were all a part of, and so instead of being in charge of it or responsible for it, we were supposed to be a part of it. And that's what he's trying to say. He says, tragically, it took conquest, facilitated by the Europeans, to transplant the indigene into the historical process by inserting him into the civilization crucibles of Judeo-Christendom, with its emancipatory moral narratives and an evolving political philosophy that discovered, recognized, and protected the alienable rights of man. See, this is where we come in with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. These include freedom and liberty, the right to the pursuit of happiness, freedom of conscience and speech, the right to bodily integrity, and the right to property. Today, we may say that very little, if any, of the earth is in the hands of its original owners. The entire earth has changed ownership several times. Native Americans are part of the sovereign mass. The land was never theirs to begin with, since merely being born on land and doing nothing of significance with it does not entitle you to ownership of it. To those who won the war for resources and transformed what was a backwater state of nature into a viable technological civilization and an unprecedented political republic, we say, this land is your land. I kind of like that. Jeff Finn Paul from the Spectator speaks to the genocide lie part of it when he says that first, no matter who discovered the New World, it is inevitable that a large portion of the New World inhabitants would have died within the first few decades after first contact. This inevitable acknowledgement by specialists in the field, the New World population was smaller and more homogenous. He kind of goes into here about the smallpox thing and the fact that it didn't matter. That there was no way around the fact. Let's put it this way: there was no way around the fact that when people started going around the world, going around the earth, that there were going to be people that died because they didn't have the immunity system to be able to fight off things that it hadn't seen before. So, see, he says, let us also acknowledge that Native American society was just as warlike as any other in human history. The anthropologists' vision of Native Americans as peace pipe smoking environmentalists, which gained purchase in the 1970s, has long since given way to more Hobbesian portraits of pre-Columbian reality. In North America, most natives were primitive farmers. This means that, with some exceptions, of course, They had no permanent settlements. They farmed in an area for a few decades until the soil got tired, and before moving on to greener pastures where the hunting was better and the lands were more fertile. This meant that tribes were in constant conflict with other tribes, right? It also meant that chiefs were continually vying for power, creating confederations under themselves. And that the question of who owned the land was in a more or less constant state of flux. In most of North America, the idea that any one piece of land belonged to any one tribe for more than 50 or 100 years is therefore highly questionable. In short, if you looked at a map of native Canada, for instance, 200 years before Europeans arrived, it would have been entirely different. In the meantime, some groups of natives would have slaughtered, bullied, and enslaved others. Should we not be grieving for those native Canadians whose land was stolen by other native Canadians? Or is it somehow okay? I don't suppose there's an app for that, is there? So, yeah, he goes on and says the idea that Europeans stole some land which had belonged in perpetuity to any one tribe is therefore ludicrous. The situation in most of North America was similar to European Europe on the eve of the Germanic migrations. And he goes on here to talk about how, in Europe the same type of thing happened where people moved around and things happened. Land changed hands amongst different people, and a lot of it was what kind of technology was a certain type of people more technologically advanced. He says that despite a few sensational cases of duplicity, most of the time Europeans tried to buy land from Indians just like they would buy an acre of land in England. If the local chief assessed to this and liked the price, then where's the crime? Many individual Europeans believed that according to the norms of both parties, they had the legal right to the land that they were working. To judge this as theft is therefore just incorrect. And I would agree with that. It wasn't stolen land. Another major structural issue is this. What precisely would our pious anthropology professors have had Europeans do with the New World once they found it, right? So in other words, we found this land, the white Europeans, right? And what would these professors, these liberal leftist professors, say that we should have done? And he says this is not a joke. Political reality has a way of crashing in on the pipe dreams of liberal academics. The reality is, if the English had not colonized, then the French or the Dutch would have. If the Spanish had not colonized, the Portuguese would have. This would have shifted the balance of power at home, and any European country which had not colonized would have been regulated to secondary status. And so the point here is, and he goes a little bit more into Columbus and some other things as well. But he says by the time Columbus set sail, the old world had dozens of clear technological and institutional advantages, which for the most part, New World populations were eager to adopt as soon as they saw them. Rather than jealously guard their technological superiority, many Europeans were ready to trade anything that Native Americans might want, including firearms. This made it inevitable that the New World society would be changed beyond recognition once sustained contact was initiated. And, one of the questions I have, would it have been better to just totally assimilate Native Americans into society rather than signing treaties and all this kind of different stuff where they got put on some reservations and different things like this? Because if you look at any other people group, right? Assimilation is the right way to go. And, can you have your customs and different things if you want? Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, but when I've seen what, the state of things on some of these reservations and whatnot, you do feel sorry for some of the Native Americans that have totally removed themselves onto these reservations and not assimilated themselves into society, and where a society that seems to be doing so much better than what they're trying to do on their own. And I think that it probably would have been better to just totally assimilate everyone in. I mean, that's what they did before Columbus and all this kind of stuff. They assimilated, if you want to call it that, whoever they took over. And obviously, we've done very well as a society here on this continent. Why they don't really want to be a part of that? Some of them, not all of them, right? But many of them don't want to be a part of that. Well, I mean, I guess that's their choice, but I think assimilation would have been better in this case. But I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. Thank you very much for listening.
This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.